Over the course of the 80s, the hard rock and heavy metal landscape was transformed. MTV ushered in a new era of big-haired glam and pop metal outfits with American sensibilities, and in 1987, it reached boiling point. That year alone, Def Leppard released Hysteria, Motley Crue released Girls, 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 Kiss released Crazy Nights, Whitesnake released its self-titled album, featuring the radio-friendly hit Here I Go Again. Dokken was back for the attack, and the loincloth-clad and battle-axe-wielding Manowar was fighting the world. On the other end of the spectrum, thrash and emerging death metal bands were changing the definition of what it meant to be truly heavy, with Anthrax, Creator, Death Angel, Overkill, Sodom, Death, and Brazil's Sepultura all releasing albums that year. Seattle's grunge movement was in its infancy, but rapidly emerging. And a little further south, out of LA, a little blues-based hard rock band, a throwback to the Rolling Stones before them, but edgier, heavier, more streetwise, and updated for the 80s, was about to take over the world. Guns N' Roses. It was in this saturated landscape that Priest and Maiden found themselves in as they began the songwriting process for their next albums. For Maiden, it was to be their 7th studio album. Steve Harris decided to base the album around Orson Scott Card's novel Seventh Son.
It was our 7th studio album, and I didn't have a title for it or any ideas at all. Then I read the story of the Seventh Son, this mystical figure that was supposed to have all these paranormal gifts like second sight and what have you, and it was more at first that it was just a good title for the 7th album, you know. But then I rang Bruce Dickinson and started talking about it, and the idea just grew.
The phone call proved instrumental, as Dickinson had been reeling from having his ideas for more acoustic and progressive elements to be added to Summer in Time rejected by Harris. He felt he had become just a hired gun, just the singer. But after Harris called him, he felt a renewed sense of optimism.
I thought, what a great idea, brilliant. And of course I was really chuffed too, because he'd actually rung me to talk about it and asked me if I had any songs that might fit that sort of theme. I was like, well, no, but give me a minute and I'll see what I can do.
The resulting album, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, released in April of 1988, is considered Maiden's best album by many fans, featuring fan favorites like Infinite Dreams, Can I Play With Madness, The Evil That Men Do, and The Clairvoyant, which Harris wrote about the death of psychic Doris Stokes, wondering whether she could foresee her own death. The album rocketed to number 1 in the UK, number 4 in Germany, number 19 in Australia, and in the US, number 12. And while musically it was one of Maiden's strongest showings, unlike its predecessors, it failed to go platinum in the States, landing at gold instead. But 3 singles from the album hit the top 10 in the UK. Typically, Maiden were more likely to find themselves on the album chart than the singles chart, and this is true today of heavy metal bands. But as Adrian Smith noted, Can I Play With Madness, landing at number 3 on the UK singles chart, was Iron Maiden's first proper hit single. Released just 1 month after Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, Judas Priest's Ram It Down. A handful of tracks on the album were intended for a proposed 1986 double album, Twin Turbos, featuring more commercial hard rock on one record and heavier stuff on the other. Columbia Records shelved the idea, resulting in the Turbo album in '86 and Ram It Down 2 years later. The album would be the last studio album with producer Tom Alom. Unlike Maiden's Seventh Son though, the critical reception to Ram It Down was mostly negative, with the band being accused of subpar songwriting, failing to match the best of their earlier work. For the most part, Ram It Down is filler minus the killer, capped off by an uninspired, albeit fun, version of Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good, which was included in Anthony Michael Hall's comedy film of the same name that year. Musically, Seventh Son, the 7th Iron Maiden album, surpassed all expectations, becoming a favorite among countless fans and earning the reputation as their finest work. Undoubtedly, it stood as the pinnacle of achievement for this specific lineup of Maiden. Little did anyone anticipate, though, that it would also mark the end of an era for the band. Around this time, Adrian Smith had begun working on a solo album called ASAP, and had been unhappy with the direction that Maiden were taking on their follow-up album, No Prayer for the Dying. Steve Harris had decided that the band should go for a stripped-down and streetwise approach, which Smith thought was a step backward. Feeling he couldn't contribute creatively, he left during pre-production for the album in early 1990. Smith was replaced by guitarist Yannick Gers, who remains with the band to this very day, 23 years later. Initially, Gers had worked with Bruce Dickinson on a solo track for the film A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, after Smallwood had asked Bruce if he had any material kicking around. As Bruce Dickinson tells it,
he was an old mate who hadn't really done anything for a while, and he was getting so depressed. He told me he was going to sell all his gear, and it made me really cross, because he's a great player, Jan. He just wasn't having any luck at the time. So when Rod told me this, I went, and Jan will do it. So I phoned him up and said, "You can't sell your fucking gear now. I've got something for you to do."
the song became Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter, which would also wind up on No Prayer for the Dying and hit number 1 on the UK singles chart for Maiden. After Smith's departure, Gers seemed like a logical choice to replace him. But Adrian Smith's concerns about the creative direction of No Prayer for the Dying were not unwarranted. No Prayer for the Dying did go back to basics, but for most people it was a little too basic, and the songwriting lacked the ambition and complexity that fans had come to appreciate and expect from Iron Maiden. Despite featuring the number 1 hit single Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter, the album received mostly mixed to negative reviews. In an era where competition from other hard rock, metal and grunge bands was growing more intense, Maiden and Priest could ill afford another misstep. Unfortunately for Priest, while they would have preferred to immerse themselves in the creative process for their 1990 album Painkiller, they found themselves immersed in a legal battle instead.
Drinking beer, smoking marijuana, listening to Judas Priest, and contemplating suicide.
5 years earlier, in December of 1985, Raymond Belknap, 18, and James Vance, 20, spent 6 hours drinking, smoking weed, and listening to Judas Priest's Stained Class album. Each man took a shotgun and shot himself. Belknap died immediately. Vance lived, but was disfigured, sustaining serious injuries, and dying 3 years later. Vance and his parents sued Priest's label CBS Records for $6.2 million in damages, claiming that Priest had hidden subliminal messages like "try suicide," "do it," and "let's be dead" in their cover of Spooky Tooth's Better By You, Better Than Me. The prosecution played the song forwards and backwards to try to prove the claims. But the band's attorneys drew attention to Vance's substance abuse problems and troubled childhood. In the end, after 17 days and with more than 40 witnesses called, Priest won the case, and the judge decided that they were ultimately not responsible. The judge said that the plaintiffs lost his case because they failed to prove that defendants intentionally placed subliminal messages on the album and that those messages were a cause of the suicide and the attempted suicide in this case.
These two boys were massive Priest fans, and that made it heart-wrenching that this terrible combination of the night and the drugs and the booze and their state of mind turned into something quite terrible.
Glenn Tipton adds that it was a landmark decision.
I had to go to court every day in a suit because they wouldn't let us in without a suit. And we had to listen to bare-faced lies. But we were victorious in the end. So in a way, we flew the flag for heavy metal, because every book, film, article afterwards would have come under fire. It would have been unbearable for everyone had we lost.
Exiting the courtroom victorious in August of 1990, the band readied themselves for the release of their next album. Like Maiden, Priest had endured a key lineup change, with longtime drummer Dave Holland departing due to health, family, and musical differences, replaced by drummer Scott Travis, who had previously played in the band Racer X. Travis's arrival opened the band up to new possibilities musically. The album had to be a return to form after the poor showing of Ram It Down, and boy was it a return to form. As Invisible Oranges put it, Painkiller, produced by the inimitable Chris Changaridis, is a sonic tour de force, a treasure trove of creative experiments, unorthodox techniques, and straight-up blistering performances. The album is metal as we know it today, Heavy, uncompromising, well-produced, and full of soaring vocals, double kick drums, and dual guitar attacks. It is simply an uncompromising, take no shit, pull out all the stops album. KK Downing told Loudwire years later that,
I just think that the early thrash metal movement was a sign that the industry had to keep evolving and moving, and so do the bands. It's just the natural course. And at that particular time, I just thought something new is always good. I can remember doing gigs with Slayer and I'm just signed myself to accepting the fact that it was bound to go this way. So then when Priest did Painkiller, it was bound to be an inspiration for a lot of bands to get faster and heavier.
and the reception to this faster and heavier sound, at least amongst the heavy metal community, was overwhelmingly positive, and continues to remain so to this very day. It's an album that, unlike much of Priest's earlier work, stands the test of time, and still sounds relevant today. So much so that the title track has been covered by more contemporary metal bands such as Death, Death Angel, Angra, Gamma Ray, and Chimera, boasting rip your head off tracks like Painkiller, All Guns Blazing, Hell Patrol, Nightcrawler, Metal Meltdown, and the single A Touch of Evil, the only track on the album to feature synthesizers. Painkiller was the return to form that the band desperately needed. And while it failed to reach the commercial heights of previous albums, reaching number 26 on the US chart and going gold 4 months later, to date, Painkiller has sold over 2 million copies worldwide. But musically and technically, it's considered by many Priest fans to be the best work the band has put out to this very day. And when it comes to heavy metal, that's what matters most. The music, and not watering it down for mainstream appeal, at which point it loses the essence of what made it appealing to metalheads in the first place. On the emergence of thrash metal and wanting to appeal to a broader audience, Priest went on tour with Megadeth, Pantera, and Canada's Annihilator. They played 111 shows across the globe, including a performance at the second ever Rock in Rio festival in Brazil, alongside Queensryche, Megadeth, and Sepultura in 1991. As far as metal fans were concerned, the Priest was alive and well, and delivering its sermon loudly and proudly to the masses. But as the tour wound to a close, tensions were beginning to boil within the band, and it would result in the departure of a key member, rocking the band to its core. In the next episode of Battle of the Bands, Iron Maiden make their own return to form, but like Judas Priest, face a significant loss in the process. And Seattle's grunge movement rings what appears to be the death knell for heavy metal.